This is Matthew Kratter's Bitcoin University. Today I want to talk about Bitcoin Core's Marxist Subversion, and this video is a follow-up to yesterday's video, which was about how should we pick Bitcoin Core devs. There appear to be odd things happening at related institutions like Brink and Chaincode and Bitcoin Core, where there seems to be a lot of social layer overlap. For example, hiring practices that may be being over-influenced by personal relationships. There's an intellectual echo chamber that seems unaware of Bitcoin's historical culture and how, for example, non-monetary data has always been treated with hostility in Bitcoin culture over the years. There's also over there lots of interest in trying to turn Bitcoin into Ethereum, and also a common interest in forcing Bitcoin nodes to accommodate Bitcoin miners and mining pools. It looks to me like yet another case of what's often called institutional imperative, or the institutional imperative, where an institution begins to prioritize its own self-interest and survival over the interest of those that it should be serving. This is a very familiar thing in these days when all of our institutions are corrupted and have been sort of changed from the inside out. In this case, the interest of those that should be being served by Bitcoin Core devs are Bitcoin node runners in the Bitcoin ecosystem as a whole, not crypto startups and malicious Bitcoin mining pools. You can see this most clearly when Bitcoin Core devs and their supporters tell you on X that your opinion doesn't matter because you've never contributed to Core or participated in the Bitcoin dev mailing list, or because you don't know how to code. And I've had people say all those different things to me. Like Fauci, they seem to believe that they are the science, and they are also always closing ranks to protect one another, as Giacomo Zucco points out in this post. In all this drama, the exceptionally fishy thing is not a-holes being a-holes, but the Pavlovian, weird, uncalled for, clumsy, organized ritual of public defense of said a-holes, as long as they are part of some elite of untouchable priests that nobody can ever criticize or doubt. I think that hits the nail right on the head. There's another interesting way of talking about institutional capture that was discussed in this fascinating thread by Bitcoin Anon. He calls this Marxist inversion. I'm still thinking about whether that's the best term, but what he's describing, I think, definitely does exist, and it does exist in Bitcoin at this point. So he says, let's talk about Marxist inversion in Bitcoin. This is a thread on my observations of the core versus knots debate as an outsider. Every organization, company, or institution will have to contend with those that try to invert its original purpose, in other words, the Marxists. To understand why I call them that, you must let go of the idea that Marxism exists only as a political system and see it instead as a worldview. Marxism can exist in your book club, your Pilates group, or your tech startup. The motivation is simple. The established order allows for little personal advancement. Preventing scope creep and organizational drift is not censorship. It is conservation. It's the immune system of the existing identity against dilution of purpose. Marxists co-opt an existing body or identity and invert its original purpose to create a blue ocean, a new market to expand their personal influence or wealth. By inverting the original purpose, they borrow credibility from the existing reputation and user base while forwarding their new goals. And I think this is a completely perfect summary of Bitcoin Core. Inverting the original purpose, they borrow credibility from the fact that this institution, the Bitcoin Core dev, has done a lot of good over the years, and they slowly change things, and you don't realize that the frog's being boiled alive. And then Bitcoin Anon gives us some great examples. For example, when politicians focus more on foreign interests than its citizens, as in NGOs and wars, when game developers stop producing entertaining games that the fan base wants in favor of their personal ideologies, like Gamergate, when a CEO diverts resources in favor of ulterior motives, forcing organizational drift, as we've seen at Disney and Bud Light, according to Bitcoin Anon, when universities focus on politics and influence peddling over education, for example, endowments, government research, DEI patronage jobs, when regulators act as gatekeepers and corporate toll booths instead of serving the public, like the FDA, the NIH, the SEC, etc., when news organizations focus on coordinating narratives over reporting events, in other words, all of them, and also, and here's the important case, when developers expand the scope of Bitcoin beyond a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. He goes on to write, if someone is consistently attempting to overturn established standards, traditions, or identities, you have a revolutionary Marxist on your hands. Bitcoin's identity as a peer-to-peer electronic cash system stands in the way of the new identity they want for Bitcoin. By introducing an endless string of small new features and changes, Bitcoin's identity will be slowly diluted and inverted to serve a new selfish purpose. And this is one reason we're so up in arms about the opportune change coming in the wake of them doing nothing about the Bitcoin inscriptions hack. So there's this endless string, this tolerance that arises around spam and around changing the protocol, and before you know it, you have a completely new organism. Think about a startup, Bitcoin Anon goes on to write, think about a startup that wanted to create a singular good product, but every director and VP introduced their own pet project, and eventually scope creep dilutes the identity of the brand. This is what we may be seeing happening with Bitcoin Core. Final post here, Bitcoin, he says, Bitcoin is conservative. I often hear the argument made that Bitcoin is libertarian, but Bitcoin is also the most conservative asset ever to exist. 21 million forever, no free rides, proof of work only. I don't use conservative in the mainstream political sense, he writes. I use it in the form of conservation of natural resources. For example, preventing the tragedy of the commons, which we've certainly seen. That's a great way of describing the spam problem in Bitcoin. Of preserving the current over endless performative progress, saving for the future instead of spending in the now. These are all conservative traits in the sense of conservative, the way he's using it. Also discouraging debt and encouraging quality. He goes on to conclude, these are all ideals of a conservative culture. It's no accident that so many Bitcoiners identify Bitcoin as the Christian ideal of money. And then he concludes, Bitcoin is conservative, fiat is progressive. And I would have to say, using his categories here, Bitcoin Core is certainly quite progressive here, and not in a good sense. They are not conserving the heritage, the cultural history, and how Bitcoin has always approached the problem of non-monetary data and spam on the chain. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the subscribe and like buttons. Hit the notification bell if you want to be notified when I publish my next video. And let me know your questions and comments in the comment section below. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.